when I see the written word and I get an idea in my head if I choose the title or if I read through the lyrics and I say that's the one, it just sets me off. God knows how I do it. I mean, Bernie and I have written songs and never been in the same room.
Elton John has never been known for biting his tongue. Across 5 decades in music, the legendary singer has built a reputation not just for timeless hits, but for brutal honesty. While many artists carefully avoid controversy, Elton has repeatedly proven that if he dislikes something or someone, he's willing to say it out loud. And that honesty has led to some surprising and sometimes shocking admissions about other musicians. Over the years, Elton John has openly criticized several major bands, questioning their talent, originality, and even their impact on music culture. These weren't obscure groups or forgotten names. They were chart toppers, stadium fillers, and critically praised acts whose success clashed directly with Elton's own views on artistry and authenticity. In some cases, his comments sparked backlash. In others, they quietly confirmed tensions fans had long suspected. What makes these moments so fascinating is that Elton's criticisms weren't rooted in personal feuds alone. Many came from his deep belief that music should be emotional, melodic, and honest values he felt some bands abandoned in favor of hype, image, or commercial formulas. To Elton, popularity did not equal greatness. And he wasn't afraid to challenge that idea publicly. In this video, we're breaking down the top 6 bands Elton John openly disliked or harshly criticized, using his own interviews, quotes, and documented remarks. No rumors, no exaggeration. Just the moments where one of music's greatest icons pulled back the curtain and said exactly how he felt. Some of these names will surprise you. Others might change how you hear their music forever. Elton John's reputation for honesty has long set him apart in the music industry. Unlike many artists who soften their criticism to avoid backlash, Elton has consistently spoken his mind, even when his opinions went against popular consensus. Over the years, he has made it clear that his criticism of certain bands was never about jealousy or rivalry, but about what he believed music should represent. For Elton, authenticity, melody, and emotional truth mattered far more than image or trend. One of the earliest bands Elton openly criticized was the Rolling Stones. While the Stones are often celebrated as one of the greatest rock bands of all time, Elton questioned their musical depth in several interviews. He famously remarked that their live performances lacked musical discipline, and their sound relied more on attitude than musicianship. Though he later softened his tone and expressed respect for their longevity, his earlier comments made it clear that he never considered them musically superior. Despite their massive influence, another band Elton John took aim at was Led Zeppelin. In interviews during the 1970s and later retrospectives, Elton expressed discomfort with what he described as Zeppelin's overindulgence and lack of emotional vulnerability. While acknowledging their technical skill, he criticized the band's excess and suggested their music prioritize power over feeling. For Elton, who built his career on melody and lyrical connection, this imbalance represented everything he disliked about certain strains of rock music. Elton also publicly criticized Pink Floyd, particularly their later work. He described some of their albums as emotionally cold and disconnected, arguing that concept-heavy music often sacrificed human warmth. While Pink Floyd fans praised their innovation, Elton felt their approach leaned too far into intellectualism, leaving little room for the emotional immediacy he valued. His remarks sparked debate, but remained consistent with his belief that music should connect instantly, not require interpretation. What's important to understand is that Elton John's criticism was rarely personal. He often separated the musicians from the music, making it clear that his frustration lay with artistic choices, not individuals. He admired risk-taking, but only when it served emotional storytelling. When bands prioritized spectacle, experimentation, or image over sincerity, Elton was quick to call it out. These early criticisms established a pattern. Elton John wasn't attacking success, he was challenging it. To him, commercial acclaim meant nothing if the music lacked soul. His comments unsettled fans because they came from someone who had achieved both popularity and artistic respect. That credibility made his words harder to dismiss. Over time, some of these bands responded with indifference, while others subtly adjusted their public stance. But Elton never retracted his core beliefs. Even when he later praised individual musicians or specific songs, He stood by his larger critique of band culture that valued hype over heart. This first group of bands reveals a crucial truth about Elton John. His dislikes were rooted in principle, not ego. He believed music should make people feel something deeply and immediately. When it didn't, no amount of fame could earn his respect. And as his career progressed, Elton's criticism only grew sharper, targeting newer bands who, in his view, represented everything wrong with modern music. As Elton John moved into the later stages of his career, his criticism expanded beyond classic rock giants to include bands that dominated alternative and Britpop scenes. What frustrated him most was not their success, but what he perceived as a lack of originality and emotional sincerity. Elton has repeatedly said that when bands rely too heavily on attitude, image, or irony, music loses its soul, and that belief shaped some of his most controversial comments. One band Elton John openly criticized was Oasis. Despite their massive popularity in the 1990s, Elton described their music as derivative and their attitude as arrogant. In interviews, he remarked that Oasis relied too heavily on borrowing from earlier acts without adding meaningful emotional depth. While he acknowledged their ability to write catchy songs, he questioned whether their work offered anything truly new. His remarks intensified tensions, especially given Oasis's own outspoken personalities. But Elton never backed down from his view. Another band that drew Elton's sharp words was Radiohead, a criticism that surprised many fans. Elton stated in interviews that while he respected Radiohead's intelligence and experimentation, he found their music emotionally distant. He argued that complexity should not come at the expense of connection, and that music should not feel deliberately inaccessible. Though many critics hailed Radiohead as innovators, Elton remained unconvinced that innovation alone made music meaningful. Elton also voiced frustration with The Who, a band he felt embodied rock excess without restraint. While he respected individual musicianship, he criticized what he saw as uncontrolled volume and aggression overpowering melody. In his view, their sound represented a kind of masculinity-driven rock culture that often dismissed subtlety and emotional nuance. These comments placed him at odds with fans who viewed The Who as pioneers. But Elton framed his critique as stylistic, not personal. What ties these criticisms together is Elton's resistance to what he called fashionable misery in music. Bands that leaned heavily into gloom, chaos, or rebellious image without offering emotional resolution failed to impress him. He often contrasted these acts with artists who wrote openly about vulnerability, heartbreak, and human experience qualities he believed were being pushed aside in favor of edge. Elton has also criticized the band-centric mindset itself. He argued that many bands hide behind group identity, allowing weaker songwriting to pass through collective branding. In contrast, solo artists, he believed, were forced to be more emotionally accountable. This belief partially explains why he clashed with band culture so often. To Elton, it diluted responsibility and authenticity. Importantly, Elton John has always acknowledged that his opinions are subjective. He has said multiple times that disliking a band does not mean denying their success or influence. However, he has remained firm that influence without emotional honesty does not impress him. His bluntness often offended fans, but it also sparked meaningful conversations about what music should aim to achieve. As the industry changed and newer generations embraced different sounds, Elton's criticisms became a reflection of his core values rather than resistance to change. He supported innovation when it carried heart. He rejected it when it felt hollow. And while some bands dismissed his comments as old-fashioned, others quietly admitted that his critiques hit close to home. Because coming from Elton John, an artist who survived trends, reinventions, and decades of fame, those words carried weight. And still, the list doesn't end here. Elton's harshest words were often reserved for bands he believed symbolized everything wrong with modern music culture. As music entered the 2000s and beyond, Elton John's criticism became even more pointed, aimed at bands he felt represented a decline in musicianship and emotional honesty. By this stage of his career, Elton had nothing to prove and little reason to soften his opinions. What bothered him most was what he saw as manufactured rebellion bands promoted as edgy or authentic, yet built around formulas and image rather than substance. One of the bands Elton John criticized most harshly during this period was Coldplay. While he initially praised their early work for its melody and restraint, His tone shifted as their sound became more stadium-oriented. In interviews, Elton suggested that Coldplay's later music felt emotionally safe and overly polished, lacking the raw vulnerability that once made them compelling. Though he stopped short of calling them untalented, he implied that their evolution prioritized mass appeal over artistic risk. Another band that drew Elton's public disapproval was U2, a criticism that surprised many given their shared history of activism and mainstream success. Elton questioned what he saw as U2's self-importance, suggesting that their grand statements sometimes overshadowed the music itself. While he respected their influence, he argued that their sound had become predictable, relying on spectacle and message rather than musical growth. His comments were not dismissive, but they were unmistakably skeptical. Elton also expressed frustration with modern indie bands that leaned heavily into irony and detachment. Although he rarely named every group explicitly, he frequently criticized the trend itself. In his view, irony acted as emotional armor, preventing genuine expression. Music that avoided sincerity, he said, left listeners impressed but unmoved. For an artist whose career was built on emotional openness, this represented a fundamental failure. What's notable is that Elton John often framed these criticisms as disappointment rather than hatred. He wanted bands to do better. He wanted them to risk embarrassment, vulnerability, and honesty. When bands chose safety, branding, or aloofness instead, Elton felt music lost its human core. He also criticized the industry's role in elevating bands that fit marketing narratives rather than musical merit. According to Elton, many bands were labeled important before they proved emotional staying power. This premature praise, he argued, lowered standards and discouraged growth. His frustration was not only with the bands themselves, but with a system that rewarded surface-level success. Despite his blunt remarks, Elton has occasionally reconciled with bands he once criticized. He has praised individual songs, live performances, or moments of growth. But those acknowledgments never erased his underlying belief: music must feel honest to matter. Technical skill, popularity, and image were secondary. Elton's harshness in this era reflected a lifetime of witnessing trends rise and fall. He had seen genres explode and collapse, idols worshipped and forgotten. That perspective gave him little patience for what he viewed as insincerity. When he criticized bands, it wasn't to provoke outrage, it was to defend what he believed music should be. Fans often debate whether Elton John was too harsh, too traditional, or too dismissive of change. But even critics of his opinions admit one thing: he was consistent. From the beginning of his career to the end, Elton valued melody, vulnerability, and emotional truth above all else. And with one final group remaining, his strongest objections reveal less about the bands themselves and more about the future of music he feared was being lost. In the final analysis, Elton John's harshest criticisms were never really about disliking bands as people. They were about fear that music was drifting away from emotional honesty toward branding, spectacle, and safe formulas. When people say Elton John hated these bands, what they're really seeing is an artist defending values he believed were disappearing. One of the clearest themes Elton returned to again and again was authentic emotion. Bands that relied heavily on image, hype, or carefully constructed mystique frustrated him. He felt that too many groups hid behind darkness, irony, or grand statements instead of vulnerability. To Elton, music was supposed to reveal something personal, even uncomfortable. When bands avoided that risk, he considered it a failure of purpose. No matter how successful they were. Another issue Elton raised repeatedly was musical accountability. He believed bands could sometimes dilute responsibility by spreading it across multiple members. If a song failed emotionally, no single voice owned that failure. As a solo artist, Elton felt exposed in a way many bands were not. This belief shaped his skepticism toward band culture itself, not just specific names. In his eyes, too many bands were protected by collective identity. Elton was also deeply critical of how the music industry amplified mediocrity. He argued that labels and media often crowned bands as important before they had earned emotional longevity. This premature praise, he said, discouraged growth and experimentation. When bands became comfortable too early, They stopped challenging themselves, and listeners paid the price. Despite all this criticism, Elton John never claimed to be the final authority on music. He openly admitted his opinions were personal and rooted in taste. What made them powerful was consistency. From classic rock to Britpop to modern stadium bands, his standard never changed. Melody mattered. Feeling mattered. Honesty mattered. It's also important to note that Elton's views evolved. He sometimes softened toward bands he once criticized, praising individual songs or live performances, but those moments never erased his broader concern. For Elton, a good song was not enough if it existed inside a culture that discouraged sincerity. By the end of his career, Elton John's criticism felt less like anger and more like warning. He wasn't attacking bands to shock audiences. He was urging musicians to remember why music exists in the first place: to connect, to confess, to comfort, and to challenge. When bands forgot that, Elton spoke up. So when fans debate the top 6 bands Elton John hated the most, the list itself matters less than the message behind it. His criticism was never about tearing others down. It was about protecting a standard he believed saved music from becoming disposable. In the end, Elton John didn't hate bands, he hated dishonesty. And for an artist who spent a lifetime turning raw emotion into melody, that was the one thing he could never tolerate.